Seth Brandel showed up at a reception where scientists socialized, waved glasses, and portrayed intellectual pleasure. Also at the party was journalist Veronica, who was looking for a scientific scoop. So far, her search had been unsuccessful. And then her gaze fell on Seth and he seemed interesting. They struck up a conversation, and Seth confessed that he had created something that could turn the world upside down. And he was willing to show it to her if she agreed to go with him to his house. Out of interest, or maybe desperation, she agrees. Seth's house turns out not to be a house at all, an industrial neighborhood, the smell of machine oil, a laboratory that looks more like the asylum of a mad genius. He points to 2 metal cubicles. Smiling enigmatically, he asks Veronica for a personal item. She, without hesitation, removes her stocking. Seth puts it in one of the booths, enters a command into the computer, presses a button. And to the girl's surprise, the stocking appears in another stall. Anticipating the sensation, Veronica discreetly takes out a dictaphone. She is already imagining the headlines, but Seth notices the recorder and instantly stops. He is not yet ready to share his discovery. After all, he says, his idea is not yet complete. He has not yet learned how to move a live orgasm. After all, he came up with this discovery for people to easily move from one place to another. He dreams of ridding the world of traffic jams. And here is his proposal. Veronica keeps the news a secret, and in return gets an exclusive on the first successful experiment with a living creature. And then, who knows, maybe she'll write a book, 1 million copies. She doesn't hesitate long. She might witness a scientific breakthrough, so she agrees. Stathis Borans showed up at Veronica's apartment late one night, like a ghost from the past. He still had the key to her apartment, a legacy of their once tumultuous but hopeless affair. Veronica opened the door and rolled her eyes tiredly. She knew why he had come. Veronica was adamant that she did not wish to resume their relationship. Meanwhile, in a lab filled with flickering screens and tangles of cables, Seth Brandel was preparing for a revolution. Veronica, armed with a camera, watched his every move. The moment of truth had arrived, the first test on a living creature. The baboon beat its tail nervously on the metal floor. Seth entered the command. But when he emerged in the second pod, they both froze in horror. The mangled, upturned something let out one last wheeze. Seth had almost given up hope by now. No matter how much he racked his brain, no matter how many codes and algorithms he tried, the riddle remained unsolved. Veronica, wanting to distract him from his gloomy thoughts, stepped closer. She saw in this strange, eccentric scientist not only a genius, but also a man who needed something more than science. After a night spent together, Veronica's casual phrase strikes Seth like a lightning strike. She immediately tries out her new idea, and surprisingly everything turns out well. So they decide to celebrate. Veronica finds an envelope with a picture of Seth. He immediately realizes who sent it. She rushes to him, hoping to convince him to hold off. It turns out that Stathis has been following her all along. The man claims that Seth is a true scientific genius. And he, Stathis Borans, intends to be the first to announce his discovery to the world. Veronica objects, but he puts her to a choice: either she cooperates or he himself will publish the article without her name. Meanwhile, Seth decides on a risky experiment. Drunk and obsessed with his idea, he strips off his clothes, climbs into the capsule and begins the process. He is sure that if the baboon survived the teleportation without any problems, he will come out of it unharmed. But here's the problem. A tiny fly flies into the booth with him. Seth doesn't notice it. After teleporting, he looks into his body again. Everything is intact, not the slightest sense of discomfort. When Veronica returned, he greeted her with shining eyes, with the enthusiasm of a boy who had just found a treasure map. He told her of his daring experiment. Veronica was horrified at first, but when she saw his burning gaze, she relaxed. And they celebrated properly. But in the middle of the night, Seth couldn't sleep. He felt a surge of strength and began to train. Then, without realizing it, he performed the most difficult trick he had never been able to do before. Every day Seth became more and more hyperactive. He could not sit still, his movements became abrupt, impatient. There was an unbridled strength in him that had no outlet. His stamina in bed became frightening, reaching grueling hours. Veronica, panting with fatigue, begged him to stop, but he wouldn't listen. One day, as he turned away, she noticed something strange on his back. There were stiff black hairs sticking out of a small wound that hadn't been there before. But Seth paid no attention to it. On the contrary, he was suggesting that Veronica try teleportation to feel what he felt. When Veronica lashed out with fury and ran away, Seth was left alone, holding back his rage. Then he went to where he could find someone more cooperative. He arrived at a bar where several men were arm wrestling in the corner and a girl was watching them, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Noticing this, Seth offered the girl a bet. He would beat any of them. The girl, looking at his body, hesitated, then Seth said that if he won, she would go with him to his house. The battle lasted for a few seconds. Seth didn't even feel resistance as he suddenly broke his opponent's arm with a wet crunch. A few minutes later he was already leading the girl to his house, excited with anticipation. After a stormy night, Seth led her to the teleporter. The uncomprehending girl began to resist. And then Veronica appeared. The girl took advantage of the moment and ran away, and Seth, enraged, kicked Veronica out as well. Seth stood in front of the mirror, studying his reflection, and began to notice the change. He raised his hand to his face, habitually bit his fingernail, and it came off easily. He rushed to the computer, his fingers frantically running over the keys. He realized that the fly had been with him in the capsule during the teleportation. And after the teleportation, the fly had disappeared. It turned out that the computer had mistaken them for the same organism and crossed their genetics. Veronica answered his call. The voice was alien, distorted, as if Seth was speaking from underwater. When she arrived, the lab greeted her with dead silence and the smell of decay. Seth moved slowly, his skin cracked and ulcerated, his hair in wisps on the floor. His eyes, once alive with excitement, now resembled two dark voids. He explained everything, and she ran for help. Stathis, her boss and former lover, met the story with derision. He didn't believe it. Then Veronica went back to get him on camera. Seth wasn't just moving around anymore. He was sliding down the walls, clinging to the ceiling with frightening ease. The camera shook in Veronica's hands as he demonstrated his new abilities. Upon seeing this, Stathis couldn't believe his eyes. Afterward, she confessed to her former lover that she was pregnant with Seth's child. That night she had a terrible dream. From her womb came something wriggling, sticky, not a human baby, but a disgusting maggot, covered in slime and convulsively trying to get out into the light. So she decided to get rid of the baby. Meanwhile, Seth searched for a solution to the problem. The computer offered a way out. The only way to regain his humanity was to mix his DNA with someone else's healthy DNA. To do this, he had to teleport with a person. Veronica sat in the cold room, staring at the ceiling and trying to convince herself that she was making the right choice. But then Seth bursts into the hospital room and takes her away. Stathis is not about to give Veronica up to a risky experiment. The fight begins. Seth moved swiftly, with inhuman ease, like a giant spider. In the blink of an eye, he was beside Stathis, exhaling caustic acid. A cry of pain pierced the air, the brush had melted. Veronica begs him to stop and pleads with him not to kill him. He shoves her into a stall and himself into a second capsule and begins the countdown. Veronica resists, at which point Seth begins to transform. He was squirming, his skin bursting, his flesh falling to the floor in disgusting shreds. He was no longer human. Veronica was in one teleportation booth, Seth in another. But Stathis was still alive. Gritting his teeth, he raised his gun despite the pain in his molten hand. His gaze darted to the cables connecting Veronica's cubicle to the computer and fired. He tumbled out of the device, squirming in agony. Veronica raised the gun, hesitant to fire. Then he reached for the gun himself. With trembling hands he pointed the barrel at his head. The gunshot deafened the silence. That was the end of the movie. If you want to see more videos like this, don't forget to subscribe and put a like on the channel. See you soon.